All right. Hello, wonderful COGS 108 students. I am so excited that we have Tyler Richards here today. I am just going to jump right in with our first question and just an introduction question. Tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your current job title and how did you get there? What's your educational background?
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks so much for having me, and hello to the COGS 108 students. As you said, I'm Tyler. I graduated from the University of Florida a few years ago, and my current job is at Facebook. I work as a data scientist working on integrity problems, specifically on integrity measurement. So think about it like at Facebook, we decide to take down or leave up a whole bunch of different pieces of content. And then this group tends to try to measure both the prevalence of like the badness on Facebook as well as how good we are at taking stuff down or leaving stuff up. So think like precision and recall.
And then how did you get to where you are?
Yeah. Yeah, so definitely a long, interesting story. So when I was at the University of Florida, I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to do something or I thought I wanted to do something in politics. And so while I was getting my engineering undergraduate, I like hung around the poli sci buildings and like sat in on some political science classes and that sort of stuff. And one day, there was a pop quiz on one class that I wasn't actually taking, but I was sitting in on, and it was on like a Friday morning at like 8 a.m. or something. And so I took the pop quiz and I went up to the professor afterwards, and I was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm not actually in your class, so this is going to be confusing when you try and grade this." And he was like, "Why is anyone in my class? It's 8 o'clock on a Friday." And so I was like, I explained to him the whole situation, and then he asked if I wanted to do research with him, and then that was the this guy, his name was Professor Smith, and he like ran the election sciences department at the University of Florida. And so I did research with them for like 3 years, and a lot of their work was on like election science, so like computational social science and computational political science, which got me into the whole like blend of kind of social science and like the engineering degree that I was getting. I thought that was a whole lot of fun. So then after I left there, I went to go and work at a nonprofit. I worked at the nonprofit. It was called Protect Democracy. And their whole idea was to try and figure out when foreign actors were getting access to voter databases. And so I worked with them for like a year and a half. And then after that, I came over to Facebook to work on their integrity platforms. So that's like the meandering journey.
Yeah, okay. So it's super interesting that you have this line of politics and like generally interested, but your engineering training really gave you the technical chops. What did you do while you were working with Project Democracy?
Yeah, so with Protect
Protect
Democracy,
Democracy. I knew I was going to mess that up.
yeah, no, that's fine. It's close. Yeah, so with Protect Democracy, a lot of the work that was happening. So to give you a bit of background on state voter files, so each individual state all across the United States, they all keep a giant list of who is registered to vote in that state. And they also do things like they kick people off that list every once in a while because they think they've moved. Most people, like if you moved from, like I moved from Florida to New York, I didn't tell Florida that I had left, and so they still had my like voter registration. So they basically try and figure out who's actually left and kick them off the voter registration rolls. And it's actually a kind of a nightmare because each state is in charge of their own list, and they can keep their own data, whatever data that they want. They can keep it in whatever form they want, and so the ability to like combine all of that data into something that's usable on a national scale is like very difficult to do, and really has been like it's difficult to do. And that's why you see a lot of universities like just being an expert in one state's electoral process. So like you have people that are just expert in like Florida elections or just experts in like North Carolina, because in order to do any like data science on Florida plus North Carolina, you have to combine all their data sets, which is hard. So one of the biggest thing that I did was helping to create basically a national voter registration list that could take data from any individual state and then could basically take it into our Protect Democracy databases so that we could run models on top of that data.
It's super interesting and daunting. And, the data wrangling that we hear people are doing a lot as data scientists. It's
Yeah.
kind of doing a lot of that there. Now, how much of that is similar to what you do in your current role?
Oh, not at all. So not at all. So that would probably be more descriptive of like maybe like a data engineer. So I wrote a lot of like ETL scripts, think just like a big old Python script that takes in data, then switches it into the format that you actually want, make sure that it's like good to go, and then puts it into a database. At Facebook, I don't do anything remotely similar to that. So within the measurement platform, a lot of the work that I do is trying to create accuracy systems on both what we call like policy and protocol measurement. So policy measurement is stuff you actually see on Facebook. That's like kind of thou shalt not like have hate speech on Facebook, or thou shalt not be spammy. And then protocol is things that define exactly what is or isn't hate speech or isn't spam. And then the idea behind that is we want to be able to create accuracy systems that sit on top of each of those to figure out how good our models are at taking down the bad content and how good they are at leaving the good content up.
Now, how much of a problem is the fact that these like thou shalt not and all of that are somewhat moving targets at Facebook, and they've changed and evolved and will continue to do so? Like, how much does that affect your job?
Well, that's usually a benefit. So it's usually that the maybe kind of the underlying world is changing around us. For example, we launched a policy maybe like a week ago that is now kind of banning QAnon. And so that is a protocol specific thing where we say, this is now, we basically declared it like a dangerous group, and which I obviously think it is. And so we're trying to like take down all of the kind of QAnon groups and more conspiracy theory stuff on Facebook. Now, the fact that that changed makes the old decisions that we've made incorrect, where we may have left stuff like that up in the past. But it's kind of a difficulty to figure out exactly when a policy or a protocol has changed, and then to apply the accuracy systems like correctly across that change. But yeah, you're right. It is difficult, but I think it always moves in the right direction.
That's great to hear, especially, just because these policies, they're not always black and white, right? They've been gray for so many reasons. I mean, the breastfeeding one is what comes to mind with Facebook. That was the first time I started to hear exactly how these decisions were being made at Facebook. So
Yeah.
it's just constant work for y'all. And I guess, how many people are on your team, and like, how do your specialties fit in with the other people you work with?
Yeah, so a lot of the data scientists at Facebook actually work on product teams. So I'm a product data scientist. So the product that I work on is accuracy systems. And so what's kind of interesting about product teams is you don't work with a whole lot of data scientists. So my manager is a data scientist, and a lot of the people, like I have a kind of a data science team that I don't actually work with all that often, but they're still on my team, and we like mentor each other and help each other out, like talk about different analyses. But in terms of the day-to-day work, I'm mostly working with software engineers, data engineers, product managers in kind of small teams. And I tend to think that like I actually didn't expect that going into tech. I actually hadn't really worked in big tech before I like worked at Facebook or tech at all. The companies I interned for a political ad firm. I interned for Procter and Gamble, the people that make like Tide Pods, and like Bounty and all that stuff. And then Protect Democracy, which was a bunch of lawyers and then like 6 data scientists. And so this is like a whole different way of working than I had kind of anticipated. And I like it a lot because you actually you have the ability to like see stuff made and produced when you actually work with software engineers and data engineers, and you don't have to do all the software engineering or data engineering yourself. So a lot of the actual group that I work with is very different.
That's interesting. Are there things that you found to be a struggle since you started in your new-ish role? I know you've been there a little while now.
Yeah, the biggest thing that I like had to work around was probably the fact that at Protect Democracy, the people that I worked with were way better data scientists than I was. Like both of them, both of the data scientists that I worked with were like absolutely incredible. And both had like one of them had their PhD in electrical engineering, and the other one was just like a whiz, and was just so good and like had a bunch of experience on me. So I knew that like whatever I was doing, I was obviously like trying very hard to make it perfect, but they would probably catch any serious mistakes that I ended up making. But if you're working on a product team, you're working with engineers and data engineers and product managers that do not know statistics. And so if whatever you end up saying, like that usually goes. That's generally what's gonna happen. You're gonna make a recommendation. And so if you really want to like have very good stats level feedback, you have to seek it out instead of it just kind of naturally falling into your lap. That was a hard thing to get used to, and definitely more stressful because you actually like really have to be right.
And then I guess in that same vein, just for the student's sake, what is your statistical background?
Yeah. So the degree that I graduated from at the University of Florida was actually in industrial engineering, which at UF is a little more stats focused. So I took a lot of different kind of stats and linear algebra classes, but I definitely didn't have like an amazing stats background there. And I've really tried ever since then to kind of be a student of the internet in a way, where I did this thing for a while where, every couple of weeks I would like try and learn a different statistical concept by applying it somewhere, just because I knew that the degree that I was getting like was not gonna 100% adequately prepare me for the working world. Um, and yeah, so that's my stats background. I wish it was like I've always thought about going back and getting like a master's or PhD, but the problem is it takes so much time. And in all honesty, I personally believe that you can probably learn most of the stuff that's actually going to be applicable by like working and, as I said, kind of being a student of the internet, um, and being intentional about it. But that's just my personal thoughts on it.
As a professor, even though I teach a lot, I also agree, right? Like the internet's great. You can learn all the things. I'm also going to plug, I think you may have written it or at least posted it in the last day, of like your advice for getting a job as a data scientist. And you have
Yeah,
some really helpful links in there, that you can learn more, both on the stat side and the technical side. So I'm going to add that, so that y'all can read it and so that we don't have to have Tyler repeat himself from what he's already said there.
well, yeah, that's exactly. It's always interesting. I'm sure this happens to you all the time, but like very well-meaning students will like ask data scientists on Twitter, mostly on Twitter, also on LinkedIn. I found people are nicer and better on Twitter than they are on LinkedIn. But anyway, I'm sure you have a much worse experience with both of the platforms than me. But yeah, so I like thought it would be better to aggregate all the advice that I ended up giving so that when a student emails me, like I can just send them to that link. And then usually the best students, not the best students, but like people that I know are really going to kill it are people that after they get like the first bits of advice, they come back like 2 months later and are like, okay, I did this. Like, here's like, oh, like I did this and I did this. Here's where I am now. Here's an update. And all those students like are killing it right now. Now that I've told your students that, then I'm gonna get emails in like 2 months. But it's it's
Like
like
you
God.
said, if I did this, then I could contact you. Um, there's only so much bandwidth that you have, but I do advise students. I'm like, don't cold email everybody and just say you like data science. Like find somebody whose work really inspires you or interests you. Explain why their work specifically interests you when you contact them and start a dialogue. But don't spam the world's data scientists with like, "Hi, I'm a data scientist. How can you help me?" Because that's just going to get ignored, and it should be. Like you only have so much time in the day.
Yeah,
Um,
but the flip side of that is I found that people on the internet are much nicer than you think they are in terms of just be. I've had so many people that have been willing to like take the time out of their day to like respond to an email or give me advice on something or like that. I am always happily, not always, but I am at least 50% of the time happily surprised with the responses that I get.
I am too. I've had generally, especially compared to my peers, a very good experience with having like lots of helpful people and building a really great community of data scientists. So, and especially, I mean, this chat came from a Twitter interaction where I like panicked right before right at the beginning of pandemic, asking the community for people to guest lecture. And I thought I was going to get 2 responses, got to, contacted them, and then woke up the next day to like 70 people volunteering their time. So like that was really, really
Yeah.
appreciated.
Yeah. I feel like everyone, not everyone, but like most of the people that like are in your class should probably take down. Like I always feel whenever I'm going on any sort of social network like Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, I have this internal pressure. Like there's this quality bar that I think I need to meet before I post anything about data science. And I feel like earlier in my career, I would have benefited if I brought that quality bar down just like 10% or something, because it got so high that I would say, I'm not going to release a project until it's like 100% perfect and 100% complete. And then now I have, half a dozen projects that are like 98% fine, but I'm too scared to actually post them.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, I especially when I started on Twitter, I had very similar fears, but people wound up being largely supportive every time you put something out. I
Yeah,
guess speaking of your projects, I wanted to talk about the projects you have on there because there's certainly a common theme, but they're on a handful of different topics. So where do you get your ideas for the projects that you're on your website specifically? So you're like somewhat fun projects, some of them are more work related. And how do you decide that that's the direction you're going to go in?
that's a great question. The biggest thing for me was I knew when I was graduating from UF that I was graduating from like definitely a good school, and but it wasn't so good that anyone that saw that I was from UF was going to immediately assume that I was competent. Whereas there are so many other universities, if you pick the top 20 universities, like my sister goes to Duke right now, if she emails someone with an at duke.ufl.edu or something, or .edu or something, they're going to be like, wow, I assume that she's competent. And that's like the benefit of, frankly, paying a bunch of money for that like level of education is people assume. And that's a great assumption. And I assume, and for UC San Diego, like anyone in the UC system, people usually will say like, yeah, I assume this person is going to be great. But for me, it was really important to bring up like, how do I get proof of competence without having the like general status symbols that people look for, like, oh, you interned at Airbnb, or oh, you went to Harvard or something. And so I didn't have those. So I knew that kind of data science projects were the easiest way for me to kind of get noticed by companies. And so then once I started thinking about it that way, I just thought of like what are things that I'm interested in and that I enjoy doing? How can I collect some data about it and then apply it in some unique way? So two of the best examples for that are I had a group of friends that every or three days a week before one of our stats classes, we would get up and we would go to the gym at like 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and then we would play ping pong for like 45 minutes to an hour, and we would play religiously. Like I'm telling you, like 3 times a week, every week. And it was always interesting because I would always beat my friend Kent, and Kent would always beat my friend Pedro, and Pedro would always beat me. And so we were trying to figure out like how do we, in a situation like this, like how do we actually figure out who's the best? And so I collected like a full semester worth of data on like how many points people beat each other by, and then I just decided to like try to figure out who was better. And then I stumbled on the like famous ELO algorithm, which is used in chess. That is like really good at groups of people who have played each other an unequal number of times to figure out who is actually the like superior player. And so then I just like wrote that up in a Jupyter notebook and like put it online. And someone saw that, like once I started applying to internships, someone at Procter and Gamble saw that because they saw it like on my resume or on my website or something, and they were really interested in it. And then I interned there. And so the way that I kind of choose projects are, can I do something that like I like doing? Because if I don't like it, then I will give up like very quickly. Like I will give up like, I'm 30% into this project, and there's always going to be some weird thing like especially in like when you work in R Python, and especially like if you're younger in your career, like you're going to make a lot of mistakes. Um, and so you're going to want to give up. And so if you're not working with interesting data, then you're going to give up really quickly. So I always find something that is interesting, and then potentially something that like shows off or like teaches a new skill to me. In this case, it was how to apply this ELO algorithm. And if I look back on that project, on that like ping pong project, it's very lightweight. I just like it's embarrassingly bad, like in terms of the code. The actual code there, like if I wrote that now, I'd be like, oh, that's terrible. But I always want to like be able to look back on projects and be like, wow, like that was bad. Like I should have done something like in totally different. So I guess that's kind of my extensive answer to your question for the ping pong one. But yeah, projects I think are just like a really fun way to learn. And usually, not usually, but maybe like 1 out of 10 projects actually get some other people on the internet to read it. And some of those people work in companies that want to offer you a job. So a good number of my data scientist friends that have like published projects on the internet have gotten job offers as a result of it. So that seems like a good enough reason for me.
Yeah, and I try to encourage students for their projects in this class and beyond to just like pick something you actually care about that matters to you, whether it's something in your day-to-day life or your community or society, but like you're not going to do it and or want to do it. I mean, in that class you'll have to do it, but in real life, like you'll get more out of it if you actually care about the thing you're doing. And it seemed to me, right, you had that pizza example, you have the UF gym, you have the UF elections. Um,
Yeah.
the things like observations you had in your life that you're like, huh, what can I do to understand this better or to make a difference? And that's what I try to encourage students to do. So I'm going to also link to your website so that they can uh, take a peek at what you've done and see that you've developed over time and that it doesn't have to be the like earth shattering to be a really cool project. Like
Yeah.
there could
The
be.
the biggest thing that I would say in terms of advice for projects is if you've ever seen someone else use the same data set that you're about to use, do not use it. It's probably overdone and it's probably boring. Like if I see another like Titanic data set project thing, like I don't even know. The hardest part with projects is actually finding the data that you're interested in. That's like probably 60% of the work. It's finding the data that you actually care about. But I agree with all of that.
To my
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
students, I promise I didn't tell him to say that. I have taboo topics and
You
taboo
do,
data sets. And there's another, the Titanic data set, this wine
Iris.
data set on Kaggle, a bunch of Kaggle data sets. Like they're great if you're learning basic, but they're just not interesting anymore.
Yeah,
They've been done.
yeah. Well, have you seen the new Penguins one?
I
Have you guys seen
have
that?
yeah, so I used that an example that on a workshop I did this past summer. So I first saw it from Allison Horst.
Yeah, Allison or something. I don't actually know who she is, but she draws really pretty things on Twitter. So I'm like, that's awesome.
Yeah, she is an amazing. I mean, she's in the art community, which I know or at least from what I've gathered, where your community was when you first started, and you've since left the art community a little bit, which is allowed. I
You
teach all
know,
my courses in
yes.
Python, so
I would say, well, part of the thing is just that, like the art community on Twitter and just on the internet is so much nicer than the Python community. Like nothing against Python. I use Python like all the time. I actually now default to Python, um, just because it's just like a little bit easier. And like a lot of the places that I worked were like Python only shops, and so like I had to get better at Python. But our community online is just delightful. It's just so great. Like I've never had a bad interaction with our community online, and I've seen the rudest people in the entire world, like on Python forums. And
yeah,
I think I've read some interesting blog posts about why that is, but I think like my guess is that a lot of people that are really good at R either come from stats backgrounds or maybe come from like a little bit less computational background, and then they like come into R and then just like get enveloped with all of it and get really good at it. A lot of the Python, maybe they come from like a math or like a comp sci background, which the like demographics of that group can be a little meaner online. I don't know if you've ever been on like Stack Overflow, but it gets pretty rough there sometimes.
I give a warning to my students. It's like, use Stack Overflow, but there are jerks there. Like,
Yeah,
know that you're
yeah,
not the wrong person. They are.
yeah. It's like I use it every single day, and every day I'm like, oh, that's mean.
Yeah. Uh, okay. So you mostly use Python now, day to day life. What does your like, and if you were to walk through a day in your life right now, so not necessarily the projects are generally what you do, but like, what does it look like day to day for you?
Yeah, I would say I use R for graphing. Like graphing in ggplot is just prettier than even like Seaborn, which I think is kind of the prettiest Python library. Like some people say like Plotly is nicer, but ggplot is just it's just better.
Mhm.
So there are a lot of times where like we have some stuff where you can like run Python and R in Jupyter notebooks, like kind of line by line
Mhm.
with a Apache Arrow. I think they run Apache Arrow on the back end. I'm not totally sure. But yeah, like sometimes I'll do like all my stuff in Python, and then when it comes to graphing, I'm like, R, ggplot, go for it. But in terms of like a day to day in the life, it's more meetings than you would expect. I try not to have meetings on like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but usually my days start with um, technically my day always starts with a to-do list. So I have a like daily meeting with myself in the first 5 or 10 minutes that is like, if I can get 3 things done today, like what are those 3 things? And then where are my priority lists? And then um, at bigger companies, I've always noticed that there are usually more meetings than kind of there needs to be. And so in the morning, I'll also um, kind of reject any meetings that kind of don't have an agenda. I'm not really clear about like what's going on in these, and so I can kind of take that time back for myself. Anyone that's worked in a large company will know exactly what I'm talking about. It gets overwhelming at times, and then a lot of it is like the within product data science, a lot of the focus goes around recommending something very specific to an engineering team that especially for like accuracy systems. So, for example, today I ended up running an analysis to try and figure out like why we weren't getting enough samples in this accuracy system. And so at the end of that, I couldn't just be like, oh, well, I think it's because of like this group in Mumbai. I had to say like, this is what we should build to alleviate this issue, and give like a very specific recommendation there. In terms of the tools that I end up using a lot for that, a lot of it for an analysis like that is actually just in SQL. Like I tend not even to bring it to Python or R because like I can run a histogram on top of like we have an internal graphing tool. So a lot of the stuff is looking at like different distributions and seeing if the distributions are expected or unexpected. Um, and so I can do all of that in SQL. And then when I start to like write it up, I'll usually bring it into a Python script. And it also involves stand-ups with like engineers and data engineers, product managers. I would say I try and spend, somewhere between 10 and 20% of my time in meetings, and then also somewhere between 10 and 20% of my time in writing communication. Um, that's one of the biggest things that has kind of changed in a work from home environment is that asynchronous communication and the ability to write is so much more valuable than it was uh, when everyone was working, you know, in person and face to face. A lot of people I feel like kind of rely on the charisma that they have in meeting rooms, and you can't really do that anymore because charisma behind a screen is like impossible. So then it just goes into asynchronous writing. It's why I like tend to write a lot. We have our own kind of internal. It's kind of like a blogging platform. So we'll write like notes there, and then also we have our own like internal groups. Mm, that's a huge portion of my day, and then I try and section off the rest of or a lot of the rest of my time for the like different projects that I'm working on.
I think it's really helpful. Just our students know what a data science project is. They have an idea, but they don't really know exactly all the time what it looks like to do that. So I love the breakdown and helping out our students understand really what it is that you do. And it always involves more meetings than we want it to involve in our lives.
Yeah.
But Oh, sometimes they are inescapable. Okay. I have some big questions for the end, the like advice questions and more philosophical questions. So what do you do in your career to make sure that the work you do is used for ethical causes?
Yeah, well, that's obviously a huge thing in the integrity space, because all of the questions that I deal with are ethical questions. So some of the ethical questions are, if we're looking at precision and recall curves for a hate speech classifier, um, what is the appropriate amount of precision to have, and what is the appropriate, like, there's always a give and take between precision and recall, and so what is the appropriate give and take for recall? So would you have a like 95% precision and a 90% recall, or would you have a 95% recall and a 90% precision? um, and a lot of that comes down to the organization being actually interested in ethics. I would say, like, one of your questions later is about like misconceptions, and I believe that like Facebook and Facebook integrity cares a whole lot about ethics, and a whole lot about the people that use the platforms on a daily basis, and about other things like basically being able to speak freely online. And so it's the combination of all those that, as long as you're working with people that you actually believe are ethical and you make the decision trade-offs really clear, then I think the ethics comes a little bit more kind of naturally. The problems that come with like a lot of ethical problems in data science are usually when kind of either one person is like overruling everything and it's just like, no, we're going to do it this way because like I have this unique interest that I don't think is ethical, or if basically when the decisions are held by like too few people. But the overwhelming majority of the decisions at Facebook are like huge group decisions, which involve so many stakeholders, and are thought about for like months and months. So in terms of what I do specifically, I think a lot of it's about being intentional about what is the effect of what you're actually working on, especially on integrity problems where there are actually real people who have real thoughts and feelings and speech that it comes like at the end of it. Um, and so knowing the full and taking the time to understand the full ramifications of your decisions, is like a huge part of what like I have to think about and what we have to think about on integrity teams.
I think that's really helpful. And you mentioned in there the misconceptions. And so everybody has thoughts about Facebook, and they run the gambit. So I didn't know if you want to speak a little bit more to the biggest misconceptions that you think people have.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't like. I want to make it clear here. I don't speak on behalf of Facebook at the moment, but I would say that um, I mean, one of the big misconceptions about Facebook is that Facebook doesn't care about like integrity, and doesn't actually care about like what things are happening on Facebook. Um, but when I actually look at it, Facebook spends more on integrity than Twitter has as revenue. Like that's the level of scale that Facebook cares about this more than any other like group. Um, if you look at there was this study in the EU like a few months ago that looked at kind of hate speech on the internet, and they basically put some hate speech, things that they knew were hate speech on different platforms, and they had a few different metrics. The first one of those is like accuracy, how quickly did that get taken down, or like what actually got taken down and how quickly did it get taken down. And everyone that is probably on Twitter is like, oh my goodness, like Facebook must have like a terrible accuracy, especially in comparison to like an amazing place like Twitter. And they're totally wrong. Like it's one of those things that the the actual facts of the matter by people that kind of, I would say, like unbiasedly look at it, like the EU. Um, we come out like Facebook comes out looking significantly better than most other platforms when it comes to integrity, but it's because of the scale that you're always going to see these incredible like false positives. And that isn't to say that like Facebook doesn't have like places to go. Obviously, I think we do. If I thought Facebook was like perfect on integrity, I wouldn't work on integrity here because the job would be done. Um, but I think a big misconception is that Facebook doesn't care about it. And the second big misconception is that Facebook profits from it, which is another thing that like I don't think people understand like the business model of Facebook. Facebook exists to not necessarily exist, but Facebook makes money when advertisers want to put their content on Facebook next to all the other stuff on Facebook. And so if we had a bunch of spam, and there's no advertiser in the world that would want to put their ads next to a bunch of spam. And so there's this huge pressure and desire from Facebook to make sure to get rid of all of the worst content. And just purely in terms of incentive mechanisms. So I think Facebook cares about it for like other ethical reasons as well. But if you don't believe that, that's fine. You can just look at the like profit incentives, and the profit incentives of Facebook are to take down the worst of the worst content either way. So you can either believe that I'm telling you the truth and like the people that I work with aren't like unethical people, or you can believe like basic economics. Either one of those is fine, but both of those are misconceptions.
I think that's really important. The other guest lecturer for this quarter is someone named Vivian Peng, and she used to work with Doctors Without Borders. And one of her talks, she talks about how the Facebook example in Myanmar got so much coverage. And then she went into all the other tech companies and was like, okay, that was clearly an issue, but that got so much coverage. What about these 4 or 5? And talked about ISIS with YouTube. And like, each platform is misused. And there is this like unfair balance. Like, yes, we should call things out, when there are issues, but it's
Oh,
not
for sure.
only a Facebook issue.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think everyone in the world is over the past 10, especially the past 10 years, has kind of went from oh, it's amazing that everything's online. We should push everything online. Everyone gets smartphones. Everyone gets the internet. Everyone gets immediate access to these massive distribution channels like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube that are run by recommendation algorithms that work on like how much people like view and how much people click. So everyone is thinking like, oh yeah, these were all great, and then they realize, oh shit, everyone's online. Like even the people that I don't actually want to be online.
Yeah.
And so you start to see like the huge negative consequences of it. I think that probably the best person online that like actually talks about these issues is maybe like Benedict Evans. Like Benedict Evans usually does a really a good way of thinking about like how much do you care about taking stuff down, how much do you care about false positives, and kind of talking through how these big moderation and integrity systems actually work across the internet. He thinks and talks about it better than most people on the internet, and better than like it's surprising because he's never worked in on integrity problems before, but still he has such a good understanding of how they work. He's a really smart guy.
I'll include a link to him too, just so people can keep an eye for him as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think that's just an important discussion to have generally, and that it's really easy to get worked up, and then a whole other ballgame to actually address these and figure out what the right solution is. So I appreciate that you and your team are working toward that and on integrity.
Yeah. The other thing is it's not just like me and a small team. Like there's a lot of people that work in content policy, which are the people that actually write the policies, and that's like a huge group of people that think about how these like changes in policies are going to be applied like all across the world in hundreds and hundreds of languages, in 100, I think we're in like 190 countries, or I don't know, or everywhere. So it's really hard to think about.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to have 2 questions that I think will be helpful to students. Is what is the toughest part, or what was the toughest part for you getting into data science or entering the field, or what do you think the biggest barriers are?
I would say the biggest barrier for me may not always be the biggest barrier for others, but the biggest barrier for me was understanding, well, the biggest barrier for me getting into data science in terms of getting like a job in data science was actually being able to prove to other people that I could do it. So I had kind of misconceptions about how to basically prioritize a few different things. One of those was resume, another one was LinkedIn, another one was Kaggle, another one was portfolios. And so in my mind, I had it probably at maybe resume, LinkedIn, and then like Kaggle and portfolios kind of tied for third. If I could go back, I would change that prioritization to portfolio, then resume, and then like Kaggle and LinkedIn like tied for third. Um, and that prioritization, like I really spent a lot of time trying to like boost my resume in some ways that like weren't actually helpful to getting a data science job, or like try to do some kind of competitions and like get good at this like very specific part of machine learning. And that usually isn't helpful unless you're like the top, 0.1% or something like that. Um, and then once I it took me a while to figure out how to actually show other people that I was good or was competent at data science. Now, uh, this first step before that point is obviously getting decently good at some of these things. And luckily, getting good at something and showing other people that like the work that you're doing can happen at the same time. I always thought that they have it happen at you get good at something like in silent, like by yourself, and then eventually, like months or years later, you like come out as of this like butterfly that's amazing at these things. But now I tend to see it as more of a spectrum where like you're consistently practicing and showing other people the work that you're doing. And then as you show them the work that you're doing, then that pushes you to get better in these different ways. So I think those two misconceptions were pretty difficult for me kind of getting into data science.
I think that is just such incredible advice all around, and that you don't have to learn everything in silence. There are a handful of people in the data science world who are constantly like, I'm going to start learning X, and then they show their path, and they're all competent people. Um, and I just kind of admire the people that are like willing to show their path,
Yeah,
and nobody looks down on that, but it like internally feels harder when you want to like emerge that beautiful butterfly
yeah,
without, um, just magically. Like I would love to, you had mentioned this on another thing, learn D3 a lot. On your other, I was like, that's was on my summer list this past summer. I
yeah.
didn't do it.
Oh, man. And then I think I forget exactly who did it. It might have been like Thomas Mock or like someone else. I forget exactly who it was, but they just decided to do like I'm learning D3 over the summer and just like posted consistently like, oh, this is my first week in learning D3. I learned how to do this very trivial. Like I learned how to make circles and put them on a website. Like, and I was like, cool. And if I had thought of that myself, and I was like, okay, in the first week I'm gonna learn how to make circles, I would have been like, that's so stupid. No one's gonna like that. Like that's really dumb. But when I actually see it, I'm like, wow, like good for this person. And then eventually at the end of the summer, it was beautiful. Like they made some like really cool stuff.
Right. And it kind of keeps you accountable. It's the same thing. People who post their workouts online, right? Like there's some accountability to that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think you can probably go too far in terms of the like kind of sharing too much learning online. But I don't think there are like that many people that are there. I really wouldn't worry about that too much. Like that's it's
Yeah.
probably okay.
Yeah. I guess my last question is, how do you think you are, or how do you like, what makes you stand out as a data scientist relative to the many other people that I'm sure applied for your job?
Yeah, there are a lot of people that apply for Facebook data science roles. Um, Maybe one or two. I don't I don't I don't I don't have the best answer to this. I think the one of the big things for junior data scientists that I think like a lot of people don't practice and don't try and get good at is the ability to actually apply data science to something that you have some sort of a recommendation or a finished product at the end. So I'll give an example to this. I'll give this the ping pong example. Like the point of the my ping pong project wasn't just to kind of like understand like who was winning, but it was to announce a winner at the end of it and say this person was the best. Um, and so that is like a reflection of my intent, which was to have the ability to, given a group of people, say who the winner was. And that applies itself in a whole bunch of different ways because there's almost no one that is like actually in industry that is going to see some really interesting work that you're doing and then isn't going to ask you like, so what at the end of it. When I worked at Procter and Gamble, one of the things that we worked on was this like neighborhood recommendation algorithm, which was like for Costco and Sam's Clubs. If you could have one more Procter and Gamble item like on the shelf, what would it be? at the end of that, we could do all the analysis that we wanted on all the sales of all the products and make the prettiest charts and do all this other stuff, but it didn't actually apply to anything, then no one would care. And a lot of data scientists are actually hired to make some data informed and data focused recommendation, whether that's through some sort of statistical analysis or like maybe just some like simple graphs that can get you most of the way. But I would say that like focusing on that and focusing on being able to communicate those recommendations is one thing that a lot of junior data scientists are not very good at. And so the fact that I'm like all right at it is very helpful and definitely helps you stand out. And man, if you see some of the senior data scientists, the stuff that they're really good at is it winnows down into making just a few decisions every like week or month, and making those decisions really high quality and high fidelity. And so the closer that you can get to improving the quality of decisions that you actually make through data science, the more that you'll actually be able to stand out. I think I'm very early on my journey there, but I recognize that like one day, not that far in the future, my entire job is going to be able to answer a few very specific and very important questions that I'm going to spend a lot of time thinking about and then give specific recommendations.
I think that is so important and something that I don't necessarily highlight enough, right? I want them to learn the stats. I want them to learn the technical. I want them to be able to communicate. But you're going to be asked a question by your boss. You're going to need to give them an answer. And I do try to say, deliverables, they need to be actionable, right? Like somebody wants you to tell them what they're supposed to do and why you're making your salary is so that they can then, in companies, take your decisions and then make some smart choices down the line, either to improve integrity, to improve profits. And yeah, we sometimes lose sight of that. I think that's so important to
Yeah,
realize that
you
like that's what you deliver.
you will work for a business, and that business will expect you to make money for them. Like, if you don't want to work for a business, then that other place will not expect you to make money for them, and that would be nice. But if you do work for a business, they're going to say, "I make some decisions. Those decisions either make me money or lose me money. Please help me work in the making me money in that direction."
Yeah.
That's
That's
like a very overly simplistic way of thinking about it, but yeah, that's kind of how it works.
bottom line. All right. Any words of wisdom you would like to impart on our students before we end this?
I have no words of like I don't think I have any words of wisdom. And I definitely don't. I would say the biggest thing that you should remember is that I'm only 3 years older, maybe 4 years older than you are right now. So I have a both a hindsight bias in that like the decisions that I made, I assume the place that I'm at is because of the decisions that I made, but that may be wrong. And like there are a whole bunch of different exogenous factors that are related to the work that I'm doing, that relate to like the career that I've had so far. So take the advice that I have with a grain of salt. The second one is I would say, which is one piece of like very practical and specific advice. There's a new library called Streamlit. It's really cool, and basically it helps you make like data apps that you can put online like really quickly. And especially if you're working with Python, like Flask and Django are just so annoying to use. And so if you're working in this class, try out Streamlit. It's really easy, and they'll let you deploy directly from like a GitHub repository. And I really enjoy them. So yeah, that's like a practical set of advice. It's not actually words of wisdom.
Super cool. Okay, I'm going to link to that as well. So students will have lots of things to check out after this.
Yeah,
And I saw it on your Twitter and I haven't checked it out yet, but I'm excited to do so.
they're so cool. The stuff that they're doing over there is like, man, it's awesome. It's kind of like R Shiny.
Mhm.
Yeah, so R Shiny is just so easy to use and really delightful, and you can spin up like a Shiny app in like no time at all. Streamlit is something similar to that for Python.
Awesome. I'm really excited to check it out. All right. Well, with that, thank you so much for being here today. I really, really appreciate it. I know you're busy with all the things going on in the world and your job, but thank you so much.
Of course. Thanks for having me.